Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode in the Tile Scrolling Game series tutorial. Today is episode 7, and we'll be adding in the item drops. That way you can actually mine blocks and get the items, and we'll also be setting up the kind of back end for the inventory system. But we won't be doing the actual visual part where you see it and stuff. Make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, but without further ado, let's get into this tutorial. So I have one new sprite, and it is called Item Drop. Now within it, I just have a bunch of numbered costume. Now these costumes correspond to the ID of the item. So as you can see here, number 1 costume is the stone block. And if we look in the backdrops, you can see in the item meta, the ID 1 is the stone. And then the ID 2 is dirt. So if I go into the item drops, number 2 is named dirt. So it's very important that all of these match the correct IDs. As you can see, these are just all the different items you can get from mining the tile. So whatever, number 9 is coal. And as you can see in the backdrops, number 9 right here is coal ore. So it's very important that you match those up. Okay, so let's start by going into the item drop and adding a when green flag clicked hide, so it hides the initial sprite. Then we need a variable to keep track of the ID. So make a for the sprite only variable called ID and click OK. Then in the very beginning, we can set the ID to sprite. Then in a when I start as a clone, all we need to do is set the sprite to something like tile drop. Now we need some position variables to position the item drop. So make a for the sprite only variable called X and then another one Y, like so. Then in the very beginning, for now, let's set X to 0 and set the Y to 0 as well, so it resets everything. Let's also set the size to 0%, that way we can animate it later, and we'll go to the front layer so it's in front of everything else. Then we'll move the set ID to tile drop to the bottom, and we'll wait 0 seconds, that way it gives time to register and it won't do a weird flashing thing. Now let's make it actually animate, so forever change size by, this is kind of a thick one, so add a times in here and do like 0.35 to make it nice and smooth. Then we want to add a minus block in here and put the size in the right. Now all we need to do is take its desired position in here, or not take, put. So we need to add the base size, which is 250, plus the sign of timer times 250. Then take all that times 25 and put that in the plus like this. This will make it smoothly set its size at 250, and it will kind of bob, and just put that in here. Next, we want to point in direction, duplicate all of this, and then add a 90 plus all of this stuff, so that way it rotates correctly. And instead of the 250, we'll do 100. And in this one, we'll do 5. So that'll just make it tilt back and forth. Then last but not least, we'll set the brightness effect to duplicate this and change the 100 to 150 and the 5 to a 30, and then take the absolute value of all that so it's always positive and put that in there. Okay, now in the very beginning, instead of doing 0, 0, let's make it go to the player. That way we can test it. So we'll just do the backdrop number of stage and change this to the X of player, duplicate that, and then do the underscore Y of player. Let's show right here. Okay, so as you can see here, if I go ahead and start this game, hopefully whenever we create a clone, a little tile should pop up at the player. So if I click create clone, yep, it does somewhat kind of work. As you can see, the animations work. It pops in, it flashes, it gets bigger and smaller, and it rotates. That means those are working, but I forgot to actually do the positioning. So at a when I receive position tiles, we want to check if the ID is equal to the sprite, which means this is the sprite receiving the message. Then we want to not run the script, so we can just do hide. Otherwise, we want to make a block called go to colon and then an X and a colon, and then put X, a label Y with a colon, no, not that, a label Y with a colon, then an input Y, and click OK. So now we want to go to X minus scroll X, like so, and put that in the X section, then do the Y minus scroll Y. Now we want to go to the X and Y inside of here. If we click on create a clone once it's loaded, it should pop in right at the player. Yep, look at this, we have little items popping in, and they're animated and they're scrolling as well. But the one issue is if we go off screen, they kind of just stick there. So let's make them hide off screen. Checking if the round X position equals the round X input and all of this, and change both of them to the Y stuff. So Y position and then the Y input. So if they both equal, that means they're on screen, so we can show. Otherwise, we want to hide, that way it removes itself so you can't see it. Okay, now let's go ahead and test this this out, and hopefully they should disappear off screen. So in the very beginning, we click create clone of myself. Here we go. It's popping up. Nice. Then once we go off screen, yep, it hides, and that looks great. Now I do see a little flashing in the very beginning. You can see that little dot thing there. So after this wait 0 seconds, let's go ahead and show. So now you can see that that little flashing is gone and it instantly pops up and there's no weird things. So now we have a bunch of tiles that are correctly on screen and all that stuff. Let's make them fall on the ground. So make a custom block called item drop gravity like so, and click OK and run that at the very top. Now inside of here, we need to do some collision and gravity stuff. So let's start by making a new for the sprite only variable called y velocity, or yvel for short, and in the beginning let's set the y velocity to 0. Now all we need to do is change the y velocity by negative 0.5 so it goes down. Now we want to go into the player and steal some of the collision script so we don't have to redo everything. So pull in this check collision point into the item drop, then pull in the get current tile into the item drop. Okay, so now we have these things, so let's rename some of this stuff. So for the check collision point, just name this collision, then colon x like so, then the x, y, all that stuff. Then up top here, we go ahead and set colliding to 0. We get the current tile, the x plus the x here, duplicate this, and then do the y plus the y like so. Then we can rename some of these variables because they're named after the player. So let's go ahead and rename the player tile ID to drop tile ID, then the player tile x to the drop tile x, then the player tile y to the drop tile y, then the player tile index to the drop tile index. So in the item drop gravity, let's check the collision of 0 and then add the y velocity for the dy. Then we can check if we are actually colliding. So all we need to do is if colliding is greater than 0, you could also do equal to 1, doesn't really matter. Then you go ahead and set the y velocity to 0 so it stops moving. Otherwise, we change the y, the actual variable y, by the y velocity so it moves down. Okay, so hopefully if we've done everything correctly, we should have these little tile thingies colliding. So go ahead and create a clone of myself once it's done loading. Yes, look at this. They fall down onto the ground and they actually collide properly. Okay, this is awesome and it's kind of satisfying because they just kind of rain down on the ground. And if we go ahead and mine a block, say, you can see that they actually fall down and they're interacting with the world, and because they're only using one collision point instead of a bunch like the player, they should have somewhat minimal impact on performance. So yeah, now we have these tiles that interact and it looks really cool. Okay, so now let's make a list that will tell the tiles where to spawn. So make a list called spawn tile drop for all sprites, and then in the beginning, instead of going to the player Y and all that stuff, do the item 1 of the spawn tile drop like this. Then let's add a random amount, so just do a plus sign in here and do pick random, pull out a backdrop number of stage and change this to the tile move step of tile manager, put that in the right, and then do a 0 minus in the left. So this is anywhere from the negative tile move step to the positive tile move step. Then to make that smaller, let's take that times 0.2 and put that in there. So this will just make it randomly move a little bit. Then make a variable for the sprite only called item to pick up like so. This will keep track of what item we're going to pick up and set that item to pick up to the number 3 of the tile drop. So now we can actually make different types of tile drops. Lastly, to make them actually look different, and switch costume to the item to pick up right here. Okay, so now we need to figure out what tile drops what item. So let's go into the background and add a new parameter in the tile meta. So edit the new tile entry and add a new label called item drop with a colon and then an input item drop. So this input will reference the ID of the item meta. So say we wanted the heir to drop a stone pickaxe. We would put the item drop as 12 because as you can see here, number 12 is the stone pickaxe. Now we want to go ahead and set the heir to null because it doesn't have a tile pickup, as well as the bedrock. Stone is 1 because stone is that. Then dirt is 2. Grass is dirt as well. Long grass is 3. Flower is 3 as well because 3 is the long grass item. Wood is 4. Leaves are 3 as well. That's the grass. Leaf logs are 4, which is the the ID of the wood. Clay is 5 because number 5 is the clay item. Torch is 6. Bedrock dirt is null because it doesn't have a drop. Ladder is 7. Tin ore is 8. Copper ore is 9. Coal ore is 9. Copper ore is 10. Silver ore is 18. And gold ore is 19 because 18 and 19 are the last ones because all of these are the pickaxes. And then to actually add these, we want to add the tile data item drop like so. So now you can see if we show the tile meta, every one has an ID that it drops. So this one's 1, and if we scroll down, I don't know, to ladder, this one is 7. As you can see, 7 is the ladder. Okay, so now we know what tiles drop what, so we can actually use that in the selector. Now to get this, we need to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. With that, we can figure out what tile or item each tile drops. So in the selector, in the break tile, go ahead and make a custom block called create item drop with a colon, ID with a colon, and an input ID, and then click OK. Now we want to create an item drop, the item 1 in tile meta, and change this to ID plus 5, and put that in there, and now we have the ID that we need to make. So all we need to do is replace one of tiles drop spawn with the X position. Remember, that's the first input, so just do selector X. Replace the 2 with the Y position, and then for the last one is the ID, so just replace 3 with the ID. Then we want to create a clone of item drop like so. Okay, now this won't work because there's actually no items in the spawn tile drop. So in the selector, in the very beginning, let's go ahead and delete all of the spawn tile drop. Then we add blank to spawn tile drop and do that 3 times. So just add a repeat block here, do it 3 times. That way there's 3 blank inputs for this one to replace. Okay, so hopefully now, if we go ahead and start this game, whenever we mine a block, we did a lot of coding, but it should drop the correct tiles. Ooh, wow, it's dropping a lot. Well, the item IDs are working though. If we mine this, it's dirt. If we mine this, it should drop tin, dirt, wood, wood, wood. But when we mine the air, it just drops as stone. Okay, so in the break tiles, we need to check if the tile we are mining has a null mine time, which means we can't mine it. So go ahead and duplicate this one. This is the mine duration, and check if this equal, oops, not that. If this equals to null, which means we can't mine it. Then we go ahead and stop this script so it doesn't continue on. If we start this now, you should see that we can't try to mine bedrock or anything weird like that. So you can see that we no longer spawn the weird stone blocks when we're clicking on the air, but if we mine up these things, we get the correct item. So as you can see here, dirt drops dirt, we can get some clay, we get tin, and all the different blocks work. Maybe if we go down to the stone layer, yep, look at that, we get stone. Okay, this is actually really exciting. So in the item drops, if we go ahead and make a new one, let's do the ID 20, and we make this item look like that. Wow, that is an amazing item. Oh wow. So this ID is 20. If we go ahead and make a new item entry 20 and just name this one whatever test, and its mine speed is null, all we need to do to make a block drop this is by changing the item drop ID to that ID. So let's make dirt drop that. So we can change the item drop to 20 because that is the same ID as this test block. If we mine the dirt, look at that, it drops that weird purple item. So you can see that this automatically works and it's super expandable. You just need to make the IDs match up and add them to the tile meta. Cool, so now we have this working, so let's go ahead and get rid of that and then make sure this is back to 2. And we can also remove that from the item drop. Okay, so let's go ahead and do one little thing because it bothers me how the items are kind of centered. So in the collision for the item drops, go ahead and add 12 to the Y right here, and that'll just make them collide above so they shouldn't fall in the middle. It should look more like they're floating on the ground. So now that worked horribly. Okay, this should actually be a subtraction sign. Now you can see that they fall down and they collide on top of the ground, and that looks so much better. So now each block we mine can drop its own unique tiles and everything is looking great. Okay, this is looking really, really cool. So let's go ahead and continue on by making it to where you can actually pick these up and it'll just add it into an inventory. So for now in the item drops, go ahead and add a new list called inventory and go ahead and delete all of the inventory in the very beginning. So this is a little bit complicated how this works, but I'll do my best to explain it. So how it works is that each time we add an item, it adds the ID to the list. Then each time we add an item, it'll check if the inventory contains that item ID, and if it does, then it'll just add an underscore to it and increase the number by 1. So for instance, if it was stone, it would be 1 because that's the ID, then underscore the amount, so maybe like 25. And if it detects that, it'll just add 1 to that, so it'll be the 1 underscore 26 now. So we need to make the functions to detect all that stuff. Make a custom block called add item to inventory with a column and then ID like so, and add an input ID. Make sure you check run without screen refresh and then click OK. Now in this, we need to make a variable called I, and this will help us iterate through the different things in the inventory and set that I to 1. Then we want to repeat the length of inventory, so that's how many items there are in the inventory. Then we need to get the current amount in that slot. So to do that, let's make another custom block called decode amount from colon, and then an input slot, and run without screen refresh for that. Okay, now we want to go ahead and decode amount from current item of the inventory, so that would be item I of inventory. Now in here, we want to check if the slot does not contain an underscore. And you know what? The slot is not a good name for that. Let's rename this to item because that's what we're actually checking. So if the item does not contain an underscore, make sure there's no spaces around it. Then we want to stop the script. That way it doesn't mess up, and this will just prevent it from crashing. Now we need two variables to decode the stuff. So add a for the sprite only variable called decoded amount. So this is the amount in the slot for the sprite only. Then another one called decoded value. So this is the ID of the item we decoded. So in the beginning here, set the decoded amount to blank and set the decoded value to blank as well. Then we need an iterator variable. So make a for the sprite only variable called letter number like so, and set the letter number to 1. Then we want to repeat until letter number of item is equal to underscore. So say the item is like stone and then the amount is 25. It'll repeat until it hits this underscore. Set the decoded value to join the current decoded value with duplicate this current letter we're on, and then change letter number by 1 so it increases. Then we'll repeat the rest of the text. So repeat length of item minus the letter number, so that's the rest of it. Set the decoded value to duplicate all of this, and instead of the letter number, we need to add 1 so it skips over the underscore. And make sure you change both of these to the decoded amount. So this is amount and amount, this is value and value. And then make sure you change the letter number by 1. Okay, so let's test this out. Pull out a decode amount from the 1 and then underscore 18. So this should set the decoded amount to 18 and the decoded value to 1. So if we click on this, look at that, the decoded amount is 18, the decoded value is 1. Say the ID is 82 and the amount is 15. If we click on this, amount is 15 and the value is 82. So now we can decode the amount and the value from just a number and an underscore. So now each time we do that, we want to check if the ID equals the decoded value. Then we can just add another item onto that item in the list. So that would just increase it by 1. So just do a replace item 1 in inventory, and instead of item 1, just do the item I of inventory with a join block and put ID in the left, and then another join here and do the underscore. Make sure there's no spaces. Decoded amount, which is amount of the item in the slot, and add 1 to that so it increases. Then to prevent it from continuing on, we want to stop this script. So if it's looped through the whole entire inventory and none of the IDs match its decoded value, that means that there's no existing item slot that matches that ID, so it needs to make a new one. So what you can do is just add the ID to the inventory. And we can't just do the ID because it needs to have the amount too, so you can just do join ID underscore 1, so it just adds 1 slot to it. Okay, so hopefully if we pull out this add item to inventory and say add the ID 1, yep, it adds 1 1 because it's 1 of the ID 1. That's a lot of ones. And if we click on this again, look at that, it increases it to 2 and then 3 4 5 6 7 8 9, and it just continues on. Now if we go ahead and add say ID 2 into the list, you can see now it adds a new item number 2 and it's 1. And if we keep doing that, that didn't work. It's just adding more and more. Oh, okay, I see what I did wrong here. I never actually changed the I by 1 to move on to the next item. So let's go ahead and restart this game. game. And now if I add 1, you can see it adds a new item, and then we can keep clicking that to add more and more to that. But if we add 2, say, it makes a new slot, and then when we keep clicking, here we go, it increases that 1 by 1. Say if we add a new ID like ID 15 to it, it makes a new slot, and then it'll keep increasing it. Here we go, and maybe we go back to 1, we click on that, here we go, it keeps increasing it. Okay, so now you can see that we can store any ID in this list, and it'll detect if it exists, and if it does, it'll just increase the number by 1. And if we add a new ID that doesn't exist yet, it'll add a new slot. Okay, so this is very important because now we have the groundwork for an inventory system, and we can later add the UI that just reads this stuff and then displays it. Okay, so now that we have this, we can finally make it to where you can pick up the items. Wow, that was a lot of work, but let's go ahead and hide the decoded stuff in the forever loop. Check if distance to player is less than 100, so it's reasonably close to the player. We need to make a custom block called can pick up item, then a colon, input item, and click run without screen refresh, click OK, and then do can pick up item, the item to pick up. For now in here, we need to make a new variable called can pick up and set that can pick up to true, because later on in here, we'll check if the inventory is full. But for now, let's not worry about that. After that, check if the distance is less than 75, so we're even closer, and can pick up is equal to true. Point towards the player so it can actually move towards a player. Change the x by cosine of 90 minus its direction, so in the motion block direction. Then to make this smooth, we'll take this times the distance to player, and then that'll be too dramatic, so let's reduce that by taking the distance to player times 0.1 and putting that in here. Now put that in the x, duplicate that for the y, and for the y part we want to do the sine. So now it should move towards the player. Then if we finally touch the player, so if we are touching the player, it'll do the add item to inventory, item to pick up, then it will just delete this clone. And just to be safe, we can duplicate this and can pick up is true and put that in there. And oh my gosh, if we test this out, hopefully when we start this game, our inventory should get filled when we pick up an item. Okay, so I'm going to break this. Oh wow, that happened instantly. That's not quite what I want. Oh, I see what I did. I did a go to player. This should be a point towards player. That's why it's instantly doing it. So you can see that I'm fall down here. I mine this tree. When we get close, yes, look at that. It moves toward the player and then it adds its ID to the inventory, which is number 4. And if we keep mining more of those, yep, it increases the count by 1. As you can see, it just counts up. And if we check, you should see that number 4, yep, is the wood in the item meta. Awesome. Look at this. We can mine new blocks and it just keeps adding it to the inventory. And if we're too far away, it kind of just sits there until we get close enough, and then it's super satisfying and it just pops in. Now there are some issues in it. Sometimes an item will be added twice and stuff, but I couldn't figure out how to work them out. So if you figured it out to make it to where it works 100,000% of the time, leave a comment down below and let me know the fix, because I'd love to hear it. I just haven't figured it out, and it's not all that often. It's pretty rare. For the most part, it works very well. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing. But anyway, this has been Owen, and I'm out.